You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Yoni Appelbaum to discuss his book, Stuck, How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. We talk about the history of moving and how the different traditions of land ownership and management in the U.S. evolved. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, amazing Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city wizards and transportation experts, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. We've also got some bonus material up there, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, the heavyweight net bike scarf is back in stock. I'm also going to make a concerted effort to make some new designs, but if you want to get one of the Buster Bike scarves or the Lightweight Bike scarf now, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can buy books at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarcholesterol. For anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook, visit theoverheadwire.com and definitely sign up for the almost 20-year-old daily newsletter. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can also find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at The Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. Some great stuff coming up, so keep on listening and enjoy the show. Yoni Appelbaum, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
So glad to be here with you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I am a failed historian.
Not so failed. I mean, you just wrote a great history book, right? So
yeah, no, I was a historian of the 19th century United States and was teaching and procrastinating and left some anonymous comments on a blog. And the blogger reached out to me and I ended up writing regularly for his publication, The Atlantic, and then left academia to do journalism full time. So now I'm a deputy executive editor at The Atlantic. But I've never given up that passion for history, and this was a chance to combine my work as a journalist with my training as a historian to really get at some of the big questions that have been bothering me for a long time.
That's really funny. My dad was a history major. My sister was a history major. My sister did medieval history. I'm not sure exactly what the time period my dad did, but they both got jobs in something else. And so when I was looking for a major in college, I was like, I want to do history. But then I was like, well, maybe not. So I did geography instead. But it led me down this world. So your story rings true in my family as well, of history interest and then turning into something else. What got you interested in these ideas of cities and planning and housing and mobility and those types of things you write in the book?
I was living as a graduate student in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is a wonderful city, in an apartment that was already a little too small for my family and already cost a little more than we could actually afford. And as a historian, I knew something about the neighborhood I was living in. If you say Cambridge, people often think of Harvard. That wasn't most of the city. Cambridge was the industrial town across the river from Boston. It was full of working class housing. My neighborhood, Cambridgeport, was a neighborhood of second generation immigrants and many generations of second generation immigrants. It had had so many waves of new arrivals come through that sociologists had actually coined a new term just to describe it and other neighborhoods like it. They called it a zone of emergence. This was a place where people landed, worked hard, their kids did better than they had, and they moved up in American society. And for a century, it had served that role. But by the time I lived there, it didn't anymore. It was preponderantly a neighborhood of professionals. And that's okay. Neighborhoods change, except that you could tell the same story about zones of emergence in almost any American city. If one neighborhood changes, that's okay. If we're losing our zones of emergence altogether, that's really not okay. And so I wanted to know what had gone wrong. How come this thing had worked so well for so long? How come so many Americans have been able to move into places with jobs, opportunities of all kinds, see their kids do better than they had done? And then over the last several decades, that had stopped happening. And that's why I started digging.
How did your ideas on this change from when you started writing the book versus when you finished it and published it?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I went in thinking I was telling a simple story of decline, that we used to let Americans move where they wanted and build where they wanted, and now we'd ruined all of that. I didn't know the first half of the story at all. The United States is actually a really weird place. For most of the history of the world, in most times and places, you are born into your identity. You're born in a particular place. Your family has usually lived there for generations. You expect to live there. You expect your kids and your grandkids to live there. You inherit almost all the important aspects of your identity, your place in the social hierarchy, your religion, often your trade or occupation. And the United States was a place which started that way. It was settled by Europeans who expected it to look like Europe, just a better version of Europe. But very quickly, it spins out of the control of the elites who expected to govern it, and it becomes a place where people, by moving, by the exercise of mobility, are able to craft their own identities. The American individualism has never been about being atomized. It's always been the right of the individual to choose their communities, to choose their affiliations, the organizations they'll be part of, the communities in which they'll live. And that was a hard-won right. We don't get it right when we land here. Initially, the great innovation is the freedom to leave, which was not a legal right you possessed in England. You could be taken up and brought back, with some exceptions. And in the United States, it gets incorporated into the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, which, as best I can tell, is the first time it's sort of like a right held against the state, that it's an individual freedom. And then, it takes almost 200 years before we get a right to arrive. Until then, even if you bought a house, even if you got engaged to a girl in town, you didn't have a right to move into a community. They could warn you out. They could say, you're not welcome here. And you didn't get to be a resident of that community. And it's only really in the early 1800s that we get a legal revolution, which lets people just decide that they're going to be a resident someplace and buy or rent a place there and move in. And by virtue of their intent and their residence, become a member of the community. And once we open up that freedom, Americans start moving with wild abandon. So I didn't know that half of the story at all. I thought this was a straight story of decline, and I came to understand that it was actually the story of the invention of something really, really precious that had shaped American society in profound ways, and then its gradual erosion.
I found that history really interesting, especially the difference between the different traditions that emerged in the South and the North and different places in the United States as states were being settled and as the settler populations grew, as Native Americans were already there. But I found that history really interesting. And I'm wondering how you came upon that, why, certain Northern traditions were different than Southern traditions when it came to the ability to move, the way that cities grew up, the way that people organized their cities, and basically, like you said, warn people out. That was an interesting piece to me.
Yeah, this stuff has long fascinated me, the idea that the built environment reflects our social values. I leaned heavily in writing this book on the accounts of outsiders who can often spot differences or spot significant features of a society that the inhabitants of that society may not recognize, right? It feels so natural to us that we could just, I didn't ask anyone for permission before I bought my house and moved in. I could just buy the house and move in. And it never would have occurred to me that the community could say, hey, you arrived here a week ago, but we're putting a notice on your door and you have to leave. And so it's the outsiders who can spot that stuff. There's this great travel narrative from George Washington, who decides to embark on a tour by land of the young republic as he starts crossing up into New England. And he's just like, this is so weird. All the properties are well maintained, but all the houses are roughly the same size. There's nothing like Mount Vernon up here, right? There's no grand mansions, but there's also not the same kind of grinding poverty that existed among poor whites and certainly among the enslaved population of the southern colonies. And he just finds it profoundly weird. These little nucleated towns are not the pattern that he's used to either, right? Because the landed gentry in Virginia create their own sort of ersatz communities based on the manor homes, the plantation houses. And so it takes a George Washington traveling through New England to show what's really unusual about that society. And similarly, when Northerners go to the South, they're astounded by what they find. It's not at all what they expect. So those travelogues are really useful historical documents that help us see that these were two mutually incomprehensible ways of living. And they fuse as Americans move west. There is this irony, right? That we have both of these traditions. We all expect to have absolute sovereignty over our own land and do exactly what we want with it, just as if we were Virginia gentry. And we all expect to be able to tell our neighbors exactly what to do with their land, just like we were living in a New England covenanted community. So we carry these two traditions with us, and they fuse into one sort of blended, where you'll find different emphases at different times and places, but one blended American way of land use.
One note I wrote myself is, are we doomed to fight the Civil War over and over again? I read your page on the Fugitive Slave Act, and now I think about sanctuary cities in the same way, and, how certain folks in the government want to push people to, do their bidding for them back then to make sure that slaves were returned. And now that sanctuary cities would, make sure to turn in the immigrants that quote unquote weren't supposed to be there. And so that note that I wrote, I'm curious about your thoughts on that, like whether the Civil War is just kind of something that is perpetual in our mindset moving forward.
One of the things I was trying to do in this book was to retell the whole story of America, but centering mobility and thinking about what it means. If mobility is the foundational American freedom, the thing that allows us to be individuals with rights who can define our own lives, what does it mean to center mobility in that way? Well, one of the things it means is that if you want to understand the structure of the society, you look not just at who's exercising mobility, but who's being denied mobility. Enslavement is, at its most fundamental sense, the denial of mobility. And we know this because we know what the opposite of enslavement is, which is what they called runaways, the auto-emancipating enslaved peoples who leave bondage for freedom, right? And they do that by exercising mobility. And that contested line between who we allow to move and who we don't is one that you can trace right through, right? So that's what's being contested with the fugitive slave laws, is people have exercised their mobility, and Southerners do not think they should be able to do that. In fact, they think they should be denied that mobility and returned to stasis. And that same contest keeps playing out over and over again. It happens on the West Coast with the Chinese. It happens on the East Coast, and we can talk about this, with the Jews in New York. It happens with various immigrant groups that arrive in this country. If you want to understand the structure of American liberty, you start with mobility, and a lot becomes very clear very quickly.
What are some of the negatives of moving around so much? You talk in the book about this day, this moving day that I had no idea existed. I moved around a little bit when I was a kid. My dad moved to different cities for his job, but I never knew that there was like a day that was set aside for people moving. And a lot of people did it on that day. And it was different in different places, but that allowed them to get the opportunity, but there feels like there's some negatives to it as well.
Oh, for sure. Probably at the height, 1 out of 3 Americans was moving every year. As late as 1970, it's 1 out of 5, right? So you're talking about an extraordinary rate of residential mobility. And in many cities, there was this thing, in rural regions too, there was a moving day. Moving day was the date fixed by either custom or law when all unwritten leases, and almost nobody had a written lease, expired on the same day. And so you have a quarter or a third, sometimes half of the population of an area picking up and swapping residences. It's just astonishing, right? In most times and most places, this is working in favor of renters because landlords need to fill their units on that day. And as long as you have the rapid production of new housing, it gives renters a lot of leverage over their landlords. They can say, fix this place up or I'm moving out. And they can also, as long as you're adding capacity at the top, you get these chains of moves where somebody moves into a new luxury unit and everybody down, 12 families in a row will all bump up, each moving into the apartment that somebody's left behind. So it can work really well. It does not always work really well. In times of constrained supply, where there aren't enough residences to go around, landlords can use moving day to jack up rent, and we see them doing that. They can evict residents if they think that they can get more rent from somebody else, and you can look at housing court records and see the misery that they record. So it's not just good all the time. It can also be, to the extent that people don't want to move and find themselves compelled to, really unpleasant. Even the people who want to move toward opportunity. And there was, I really need to stress, an enormous cultural importance attached to this. There's this great story of an old lady who doesn't want to move one year, but decides to draw all her curtains and shutter the windows so that her neighbors will think she's moved and they won't judge her for being the stick in the mud who doesn't move. Stories like that tell you that there was a real cultural value attached to this kind of mobility that we have sort of lost today. But even amid all of that, moving is really uncomfortable. I've never wanted to move. I've never been excited about relocating and packing and unpacking. But I've come to think of it a lot like exercise. I don't usually want to get up off the couch and take a jog. Every expert I've ever talked to tells me it's not only good for me to take a jog, it'd be better if I jog more often. And I can feel pretty good afterwards. Like the things that the jogging gets me are good things. And moving is a lot like that. Very few people genuinely exult about moving. What you find Americans really excited about in the 19th and well into the 20th centuries is the things they're getting from moving. And so, although moving day is sort of this wild, riotous festival of relocation, you also, like, your possessions got banged up and the cartman overcharges you and it's all chaos. And what really excites them is what they're getting out of it, not the experience itself.
Lewis Wirth wrote about urbanism as a way of life. In that piece, he wrote about pluralism and the idea that, you go to a place and you join a lot of groups and you have weak ties, but that's what makes cities kind of run, because you can specialize. You can go somewhere and you can be something specific instead of in a smaller town where everybody knows who you are, everybody's up in your business, all that stuff. And so I'm wondering how much this moving is connected to the urbanization of the United States as well.
Yeah, urbanization clearly plays a large role here. You find it already at remarkably high rates while we are still a nation of farmers. And that's worth stressing. It's not mostly east to west. We think of American mobility as sort of, I don't know, the Conestoga wagons going west just as fast as you could dispossess the native peoples. But that's only ever a small fraction of Americans. Most Americans live in the settled East, and that's where mobility is perhaps highest, actually, on an annual basis. And so people are moving, and they're moving around rural areas very often. It really disconcerts Tocqueville and other observers. They're like, look, you've got a perfectly good farm where you are, you're prosperous. Why would you pack up all your belongings and move someplace else? They really think that this is like a character flaw of Americans. But Americans do this. And then as we start to urbanize, we do it even more. And some of the mobility that I'm talking about is about people moving in off the countryside, but it's also people making money in the city and going back out to the countryside to buy a farm. So the flow goes both ways. And I think what you're pointing to is that there are these outgrowths of that mobility, right? Old world literature is often about the claustrophobia of village life and trying to escape that heritable identity that you got at birth. New world literature is often about nostalgia for village life, right? But it's all written by novelists who left the village and went to the city. And so there is this possibility in cities of joining organizations, America from very early on, probably from the colonial period, certainly the early republic, is the only place on earth where most people do not belong to the church into which they are born. That's been true here for more than 200 years, which is wild as a fact. We're also consistently over that period a more religious country than most of the old world. When people choose their religious denominations, they commit to them. It's an act of choice. Residence is like this too, right? Like even the people who are not moving end up more committed because they made the choice not to move. It was a choice, right? It was not the default assumption. And so you find these really vibrant communities throughout America, and in urban spaces, the constant relocations are what give us the other half of Tocqueville's observation, right? He and the other Europeans who come here, they're like, God, these Americans, they're terrible. They're always leaving, always moving. They always want something better than what they have. They're never content. Boy, they've got this amazing civic life. That's really great. I wish we had that in Europe. And they never draw the connection. They never say the mobility is producing the civic dynamism and the really strong organizational and associational life of the United States. But that's true. That is what is doing it. And over the last 50 years, as we've stopped moving, it's atrophied. That's why we are bowling alone.
You mentioned the wagon trains. I think back to a story my mom tells about a family member who led wagon trains from a long time ago to California. And one of the trains that he led actually split off from the Donner Party before they got stuck in the Sierras. And so I guess I'm partially here because of a smart relative that decided not to go with the Donner Party through the snow. So
they're dangerous to mobility too.
They're sometimes dangerous. I mean, the Oregon Trail game tells us that as well. You also brought something, I mean, the mobility of the cities is something that also interests me, from a geopolitical standpoint today. I mean, I'm thinking about China and how many people have moved from rural to urban areas there at this time. And I think in the last 20 years, and I've seen this stat somewhere, that basically the population of the United States have moved in China from rural to urban areas, 330 million people. And so I'm wondering how that kind of movement has gained their society while our stagnation has kind of reduced some of the things that we're able to do.
I have been to China exactly once in my life, and it was a couple decades ago. So I can't speak with great expertise. There were ways in which walking around the cities there helped me understand what the 19th century might have felt like here. One city that was in a coal mining region, which was like the old accounts of Pittsburgh. It was literally snowing coal ash, and I'd never seen anything like that before in my life. But other cities that were just throbbing with people. China is not the United States politically, though. And my understanding is that many of those people moving in are moving in without legal residence in the cities where they land. They're in a liminal state. They don't have that basic American liberty, which was to just declare where you wanted to live and by moving, make it your residence. And I think China's gotten a lot of benefits out of mobility. And part of its dynamism. And one of the reasons its economy is growing so fast is that it is letting the population move. But it only got half the equation, right? That there is still this American political liberty that said, look, when you land someplace, it doesn't matter if you're born in Indiana. If you move to California, you can say, hey, I live here now. And then you are a full citizen with full political rights. And I think that actually, that second half of the equation is something that may hurt China in the long run, that it hasn't given hundreds of millions of internal migrants the ability to belong to the communities where they land.
Kind of changing directions here. I've seen a lot of discussion about progressivism and NIMBYism, and I'm wondering if progressivism equals NIMBYism, or if it's something different, or something about the times that people grew up in, or maybe something about the political system as it exists that leads people to maybe oppose housing and zoning reform and things like that.
Yeah, the cover of The Atlantic this month says how progressives froze the American dream. It's an excerpt from my book. And I want to be careful about what I mean by that claim, because I've gotten a little bit of pushback about that. And I mean, actually, several different things simultaneously, right? One is the thing that broke American mobility was the layered reforms of 3 generations of progressives. So there is a historical claim here about who broke American mobility. And I think that that's pretty solidly grounded, and we can talk about that. It is certainly true today that progressive jurisdictions are the places that people most want to live. I know this because of the real estate prices there, right? And also the places that are growing fastest economically and producing the most opportunity. They're the places where, when you look at something like Rod Chetty's Opportunity Atlas, they're the places where people should want to live, right? And Americans are smart. They figured this out. There are also the places where the rules against housing are most stringent, where it is most difficult to produce new housing. In California, there was this great study which showed that for every 10 points of liberal vote share a city went up, its housing permits went down by 30%. So it's not just Democrat versus Republican. It's like the more progressive a jurisdiction gets, the harder it gets to produce new housing there. So that's the other very specific claim I mean here. And that's not to say that progressivism is inherently NIMBY. One of the things I found in my reporting for this is that there's an enormous generational divide. And this dates back to the 3 generations of progressives who got us into this. Younger progressives are increasingly YIMBY, right? That they are people who no longer view growth as the world's greatest challenge or as a dirty word. And in fact, they modify it with things like smart growth, right? That they see growing in a certain way as actually a way to make the world better. And so there's always been another strand of the progressive tradition going back to the earliest zoning laws. There are people putting in place zoning as a means of racial and economic segregation. And there are other progressives standing there and screaming at them and saying, don't do this. You are actually doing great damage to the world. And so it's not that progressivism is inherently evil. It is rather that for a long time in America, one particular strain of progressivism won on these issues. And I think we are seeing a generational reversal where the other strain is coming out among younger progressives who really see the problems this has caused.
Another interesting thing that's related is we talked to Chris Redfern and Anthony Orlando recently about a paper that they wrote about the growth of California and Texas and how, the regulatory regimes seemed not to matter. It's actually how much open land you have to build sprawl, sprawl that's actually next to opportunity centers anyways. And California actually ran out of that a number of, decades ago, and Texas is coming up fast on the same problem. And so I find that interesting that maybe part of the problem is also not necessarily just the NIMBYs and those reformers and the zoning regulations, but just the fact that our penchant for being able to build single family homes and the bank's ability to, focus on that specific type leaves us in a worse position because we can't do the infill or the change of direction that maybe we need to because of a different type of housing that we need.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's easiest to build where there is no neighbor to object. So where you get that open land, it's relatively easy to construct single family homes or frankly any kind of housing. And where open land becomes less available in direct proximity to really prospering regions, then it gets harder. But that assumes a lot of priors. It assumes that somebody can, in a place with tremendous demand for housing, simply build new housing, that there's going to be some sort of a regulatory process, even in Texas, which is tuned differently from a regulatory perspective. Even a city like Houston, which doesn't have zoning per se, it has all kinds of land use regulations that are layered on, all kinds of community input and review processes. And so you're talking about different ends of a spectrum, but it's all very, very different than it was 50 years ago. And so the broad point is right, that it's a lot easier to do this where there's open land, but it assumes a set of priors that I don't think we have to assume. It is possible to have a whole different approach to this that yields really different outcomes And even in Texas, Austin has been building housing lately, and the rents have been going down lately. And that's a pretty cool proof of concept that if you do, in fact, flood a market with new housing, you can not just arrest the rate of growth, you can actually drive down the cost of housing. And it's the kind of approach that could be applied more broadly. That wasn't because they had lots of open land in Austin, it was because they made it a lot easier to build.
I was also interested in a piece of the book that talked about how, Americans liked apartments, much to the chagrin of some of the folks who were trying to reform. They liked living in these places where they had opportunities. And now, we have this kind of situation where there's a lot of preference surveys out there that say, half people like single family homes or half people like living in the proximity to stores and things like that. And people will thread the needle in terms of what that actually means, what preferences people actually have. But I'm just curious about that kind of historical finding that Americans really liked apartments and that befuddled the reformers.
Yeah, apartments were weird to the reformers. And here, we have to go back to the beginning of the story, right? 19th century, everybody moving around, cities are growing. And one of the things that happens in the cities that are growing is they start building up. In particular, they start building apartments, which were often called tenements, for the newest arrivals, for immigrants. And these are really practical dwellings. They're practical in the same sense that a little house on the prairie is practical. Not a particularly safe or sanitary place to live necessarily, but a heck of a lot better than the country where you are coming from and your first step towards something better. And the reformers are really appalled by the flood of these people into their cities, and they are convinced that apartments per se are immoral. I just have to say that again because it's like a weird thing to wrap your mind around, to view the world through the mind of the 19th century, right? Like they think that living in an apartment is a morally corrupting thing. And they're coming at this from the perspective of a nation into which they're born, which was preponderantly rural. And by the early 20th century, mid 20th century, it's preponderantly urban, right? So they've all been born in the farmhouse and now they're living in the city. And they're looking at these immigrants who seem to like apartment living. And they're thinking, like, how do we Americanize them? How do we make them less dangerously foreign? And the answer that comes to them is like the single family home. If they grew up in single family homes the way we grew up in farmhouses, all would be well. So the single family home becomes an object of government policy, and this is really clear, as a means of Americanizing and assimilating immigrants, right? It's equated with virtue, it's equated with Americanism. Folks like Herbert Hoover promoted on that basis. Folks like Herbert Hoover, who, by the way, was like living in a New York City apartment for much of the time period I'm talking about. So there's a little bit of do as I say, not as I do. The key reformer here is Lawrence Wheeler, who is Mr. Tenement Reform. He writes the big reports, he chairs the big commissions, he becomes the city official in charge of enforcement. More than anyone else, he's the guy who gives us our modern image of the tenement as a hellhole, which it mostly was not. But he tries very hard to persuade Americans that tenements are dangerous and should be banned. And he's at this conference and somebody says, how do we keep apartments out of our communities? And he says, well, here's the real problem. If you put this to a vote, a referendum, you're going to lose because, if in the abstract, I might tell you that I'd like to live in a 50-room mansion, there are certain, he doesn't say this, but I'm thinking like there are certain constraints, right? Like all of these are embedded choices where we're trading off various goods, right? So apartments are a very good, cheap mode of living for people who are trying to get a foothold in a city. And Wheeler knows this, and he knows that it's going to lose the vote. He says, you can't just ban apartments, but there is a trick that I've used in New York and that you can use. If you call your anti-apartment regulations fire safety, you can layer on so many requirements that they become prohibitively expensive to build. But he says, you've got to be careful. Don't add those same requirements to the single and multifamily homes, the 1 and 2 family homes, because those are good housing. You don't want to make them too expensive. So it's like not about fire safety at all. He's very clear about this. He's not trying to save anyone's life. He's just trying to find a way to ban apartments. And, we have not grown past that entirely. We still have all kinds of building codes and zoning regulations that are purely protectual in exactly this way. They're intended to drive up the cost of housing, to make it prohibitively expensive for poor people to move into areas. And Wheeler says it out loud, and we've been doing it ever since.
I just think about parking, and then across the bay, I think about student noise. Those are the things that have continued that tradition of fire safety. And then the Supreme Court, kind of jumps on this. And I was struck by the language, like a pig in a parlor instead of in the barnyard, trying to, basically demonize where people should live and how people should live. And that was Euclid versus Ambler Realty, which is the main standing in terms of zoning regulations in the United States and where things changed, or at least were regulated to where we are today.
Yeah, the guys who write the first zoning codes, they know what they're doing is unconstitutional. I know that because they write it at the time. Like they understand this, that this was not the traditional understanding of what they call police powers, the ability of cities to regulate their residents. And they pull off a kind of a magic trick. They say a police power can be constitutional if it's ubiquitous. So what we need to do is to spread zoning so far and wide across the United States that by the time it gets to the Supreme Court, it will retroactively have been a legitimate exercise of the police power. And they pull that off. They spread zoning very, very widely. But zoning has a flaw at its heart, which is that if you're saying, you know, a pig in a barnyard is a proper thing, but a pig in a parlor is not a proper thing, what you're effectively saying is some people should get to live in the parlor and other people should have to live in the barnyard. You know, we had lots of land use regulations before zoning, but they tended to be place neutral regulations. So you could say, you can't build a tannery next to housing because you will hurt the people living in the house. That's bad. But you had to show actual damage, and it needed to be the same regulation that applied everywhere. Zoning says some things are perfectly legitimate over on this side of the tracks, and they're illegitimate over on the nice side of town. And that is a tough thing to get away from once you've started down that road.
Yeah, and in Modesto and in San Francisco and other places where the Chinese laundries aren't even a harm. People at the time said, you know, these don't harm anybody. They're just uses that you don't like because there's Chinese people in them. And I found that interesting too, is that like a lot of people were actually very vocal about this doesn't harm anybody. So why are we making these changes?
It's amazing. I mean, I had read in a number of histories of zoning that the first ordinance was about laundries at Modesto. I couldn't find much about it. And so I spent a long time digging back through contemporary accounts to figure out what was really going on in Modesto. And there is this forgotten civil rights hero there, a Chinese launderer named Hung Ki, who is operating his laundry. And he's trying to get his piece of the American dream. You know, after the gold rush, California is preponderantly male, right? All those miners head out there. They really smell because none of them want to do laundry. They view it as women's work. It gets so desperate in San Francisco that somebody comes up with a bright idea. He starts gathering everybody's laundry, putting it on a boat to Hawaii. They wash the clothes in Hawaii and put them back on the boat to San Francisco to get a clean shirt. That's where the situation stands, right? And so the Chinese who are being discriminated against, driven off the railroads, out of the gold fields, they see that laundry is their chance, right? They can do this work and have their purchase. And so in communities like Modesto, that was the primary thing the Chinese were doing. And they move into the white neighborhoods in order to do this because it's like a coffee shop. You don't walk out of your way to get to a different Chinese laundry. You go to the one that's on your corner. And so they're moving into the white neighborhoods. The elite of the city are really frustrated. They try to convince the residents not to patronize the Chinese laundries. That doesn't work. Some of them try arson. They try burning the Chinese out, and the Chinese rebuild. They try vigilante violence. They put on hoods and march through Chinatown, smashing windows and beating people up. That doesn't work. And then they hit on zoning. They write an ordinance. This is America's first zoning law. All laundries need to relocate west of the tracks and south of G Street. And I pulled an old map of Modesto, and there is only one block on that map at the time, west of the tracks and south of G Street, and it says Chinatown. So this is a racial segregation ordinance that is written in the arid, race-neutral language that could pass legal muster. And it does. And that is America's first zoning law. And so that history, I think, was largely lost. Hung Ki challenges this in court, fights it all the way up to the California Supreme Court as a test case. And he's forgotten because he loses. He fought a good fight, but America goes in a different direction.
I think you'd do well maybe if you put together a plaque and brought it to Modesto and see if you can place it somewhere, or look on those Sanborn maps and see if you can find where that laundry was.
I would love to memorialize that, right? Like the guy goes to jail, he gets beaten up in jail by another inmate. I mean, he really pays for his willingness to fight this, but he does it because he's trying to build a better life for himself. And he hangs on in Modesto even after he loses the case. And people like that who are continually pushing against the boundaries and fighting for their own right to mobility are the people who enable America to grow as it does.
I saw your discussion with Rachel Cohen at Vox, and I kind of wanted to continue one of her questions on the era of deregulation. We just chatted with Stacey Mitchell of ISLR, and there are a lot of things about the increase in conglomerates and the reduction in access to goods and services between then and now that seems to fit your narrative actually pretty well. We deregulated, but it also consolidated power in a few hands versus a many. And I'm wondering how that consolidation maybe was part of this story about the grinding to a halt of mobility because of how many companies were coming together as conglomerates, maybe how many people were consolidating power in cities as the ability to kind of keep people out or to make sure that they weren't building housing. There seems to be, it feels like anyways, this story about deregulation in the 70s and 80s kind of leads us down this road to overregulation that we're seeing now in the housing market.
Yeah, it's a super interesting question, and it's kind of a funny dynamic. The forces in the 60s and 70s that give us the modern problem, right? You have a couple generations. You have the original zoners in the original progressive era who developed zoning as a tool of racial segregation, but also just of imposing order and rationality on cities. Then you have a second generation in the New Deal who take this national. The New Deal makes federal housing lending contingent on communities being zoned. And so lots of communities that haven't adopted it are basically forced to adopt it. The third generation arrives in the 60s and 70s, and these are people who have grown jaundiced about the New Deal. They're looking at the marriage of big business and big government. They think the regulatory agencies have been captured by businesses, and they're often not wrong about that. They can see the consolidation of corporate power, and they come up with an alternative. They say the problem here is that government is no longer protecting the public interest. We need to pass new laws that allow the public to challenge governmental decision-making, because otherwise ordinary citizens in small communities are powerless in the face of this kind of consolidation. So it's a critique of the New Deal that comes from the left, and it's a critique of corporate power. And you can think of the figures who launched this critique in their own ways. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is a critique of the way that environmental regulation has been captured by the chemical industry. Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed talks about how highway safety regulation has been captured by the auto industry. And Jane Jacobs's Death and Life in Great American Cities, its assault on urban renewal, is about how the governance of cities has been captured by the real estate development industry and its unholy alliance with big government, which wants to develop things wholesale. So there is a big revolt against bigness and consolidation. The trouble with it is that it pushes to the opposite extreme. So the remedy it creates is a set of legal changes which enable people to sue, and to do this in two ways, right? One is you no longer, in most instances, need to demonstrate that you yourself have been damaged by a decision that government makes in order to challenge that decision. So a public interest group can sue. And then the other big change it makes is that it allows people to challenge the government for not following its own rules and procedures. And we get a bunch of different laws that in different ways enable people to bring these kinds of legal challenges. So if the first two generations of progressive reformers have made every question of construction in America subject to government approval through zoning and other kinds of regulation, this third generation then gives any individual who dislikes the government decision the power to bring the government to court. And that's a power that is unequally exercised. And this is the complicating wrinkle. It is the wealthier, better educated people in America who can work the bureaucratic system. They know how to navigate it. They have the resources to bring the government to court. In those communities, a single individual, a small group, can grind everything to a halt. They can keep the development from coming in there. In other communities, that's not the case. They may not have the resources to challenge governmental decision-making, to challenge the granting of a permit, for example. And so you get this real inequality taking root. And it comes from this well-intentioned place. People can see the consolidation of corporate power. They want to challenge it. But their remedy is not to make government strong enough to challenge corporations. Their remedy is to kneecap government, to make it impossible for government, to a democratically elected government, to act in the public interest at all by essentially distributing a veto to anyone with enough money to exercise it.
I just wrote a newsletter item about the Chevron decision, as well as this thing that just came out the other day about NEPA and the regulations that govern how it's basically administered. And so, the Trump administration is trying to get rid of the way that things have been done since 1977. And I think back to like that initial environmental movement about how it allowed people, individuals, to sue with standing based on harms and how that changed the game completely. But as you said, it kind of goes the other direction. And we're living in this weird, strange world where we're getting to the point where they're trying to do these things that I don't necessarily agree with, but people have been complaining about for quite a while.
You can see that part of what Trump has done is harness very real and I think justified anger about some things. I think the progressive movement has been very slow to recognize that in its effort to pass laws and procedures that allow people to give voice and incorporate community and minimize harm, it has been doing real harm at times, that the balance is off. Trump has been very good at discovering grievances. This is one of his superpowers, giving voice to complaint. The problem with progressives not recognizing this themselves is they're handing political weapons to their opponents whose equal and opposite reaction may be even worse, right? If we swung the pendulum way too far toward local control in the 70s with those legal changes, and the harms have been accruing ever since, what Trump is proposing to do is to sweep away environmental protections, in some cases almost entirely. And there's got to be a better balance, right? That there are ways to protect the environment, to protect some number of historical structures without landmarking parking lots, which is a thing that in my own community, people have done. And so, if you can get that balance right, progressivism can continue to try to safeguard the environment. But there is a real problem with a lot of these laws. The overwhelming majority of CEQA cases that have been brought in California, and that was a law pushed as a means of protecting open spaces, have not been about open spaces. From the very beginning, those cases have preponderantly been about multifamily development in dense urban areas. That is where the cases go. And so if that's what the law is being used for, what it actually does in some sense is push the development out in terms of sprawl, right? I think you can make a very compelling empirical case that a lot of these environmental regulations had precisely the opposite effect that they intended. They made it very, very hard to build in areas with other people around and led to much more development of greenfields, which was the very thing they were supposed to stop. And at some point, I think progressives need to take a step back and say, okay, we know what we are trying to accomplish. Has the law done that? Or did this actually backfire on us? And if so, without abandoning that very good goal, is there a way we can tweak the law or change our approach here so that we're advancing instead of undermining that goal?
In the book, you write about how the 2016 election told you a little bit more about this mobility and what's been happening. And I'm curious about that. I'm also curious, and I thought about the same time, the 2016 election kind of coincided with the Brexit movement. And if we have seen the same thing happen here in the United States that we saw in England or in Europe.
Yeah, the United States was remarkable for its mobility, but you can see some of these same trends. And I do think that, there's an enormous housing debate right now in England. And if you look at a map of the Brexit vote, it mirrors a map of the last two elections in the United States, where rural areas, depressed industrial cities, these are bases of support for the conservative parties. And the thriving metropolises are the basis of support for the progressive movements on both sides of the Atlantic. And that pattern does relate to mobility. In this particular way, there is research in what happens to people who move and to people who want to move and can't. If you want to move and can't, you are likely to become more cynical, more disconnected from your community, less likely to join organizations, to form new friendships. You are also likely to see the world as a zero-sum game where others' gains come at your expense, to see it as a rigged game. The anger grows too. If you move, the act of moving, right? So if you start with a sample of people who all say that they intend to move in the next year, and then you look at the ones who pull it off and the ones who don't, the simple act of moving makes you more optimistic. It makes you likelier to see that others' gains are beneficial to you, right? Like you're moving into a new community, somebody else is doing well, you're doing better, you feel optimistic, you reach out, you're more likely to form those friendships, to join the clubs and organizations. You have the set of characteristics that people around the world for 200 years thought of as quintessentially American. Americans were a bunch of optimists, sometimes heedless optimists, but they were people who thought the future would be better than the past. They thought that they could collectively get ahead as opposed to fighting over a fixed size pie where your neighbor's slice comes at your expense. And we know that this played out in voting in 2016 too, that people who still lived within a few miles of where they've been born were overwhelmingly more likely to vote for Donald Trump. Those who had moved a little became somewhat more likely to vote for Democrats. If they moved a lot, they were a lot more likely to vote for Democrats. But you can also map that onto the political attitude. So I think that there are ways, it's tough to tell a progressive community, you got to let them build multifamily housing in your backyard. There are so many reasons, so many rational reasons people might oppose that. They might say, I'm worried about parking. I'm worried about stressing the existing infrastructure of the schools. I'm worried about traffic. I'm worried about my view. But if you go to that same person and you say, Do you want to live in an America where the blue states and cities are shedding population because people are no longer moving toward opportunity? They're now moving toward cheap housing, and they're losing political representation and getting locked into permanent political minority. Do you want to live in a city where young families can no longer move in and the service workers who are making your lives possible can't afford to share the community by living alongside you? Do you want to live in a city where people have longer and longer commutes, right? Like, and do you want to live in a country where we're divided between haves and have-nots, where there are these islands of blue prosperity amid a large sea of red suffering and anger, and reap the consequences of that? Are you happy with American politics over the last 8 years? Very few progressives I know say, yes, I'm very happy with the way elections have gone for us lately. I'm really happy with the direction of American policy. Let's keep steady on. This is great. And if you frame it in those terms and get them to see that building that housing in their backyard is in fact the solution to these problems, the thing that the lack of that housing caused these problems and the addition of the housing can help solve them, suddenly it's a whole different conversation.
I got a couple more questions for you before I let you go. We talk a lot about transportation on this podcast, as you noted before we started chatting. And the idea of mobility is something that, from the way that you write about it is about economic mobility. But for the most part, we talk about, transportation as human mobility. I'm curious how the transportation policies have led to this kind of stagnation as well. We had folks on previously to talk about how the highways have led to the expansion of the suburbs and more kind of conservative thought. We've talked about the accessibility that people have to jobs and the economic opportunities that they have in that way. But I'm wondering how the infrastructure discussion melts into the idea that you're talking about, which is like the broader mobility across a country.
Yeah, I'm sorry to tell you that the father of zoning, Edward Murray Bassett, got interested in the issue first because he was a transportation advocate for better streetcar service out to his Brooklyn neighborhood. That was his gateway into the topic.
Dear.
These things are intertwined, though. What he was thinking was New York doesn't have to be a festering hellhole of immigrant apartments. If we got really good streetcars, it could be a low density place because people could commute. You could compress distance by speeding up the time of commuting through good streetcar service. So he was passionate about single family homes, but he saw better transportation as the way to do that. I think we can flip that around on Bassett and think about the way over the last 100 years, a lot of our focus in investment in infrastructure has not been about genuine mobility, about helping people get to the places where their families will have more opportunities. It's been about allowing people to get stuck, right? Like, we have built this enormous infrastructure and then set up the federal financing of homes to encourage people to find a place and stay there. And if you tune your transportation policy a little bit differently, you can give people many more options. You want people to be able to switch jobs. That is, empirically, they will end up better off in the long run if they're able to jump laterally and diagonally through their careers. You want people to be able to switch residences. And if you get density and good transportation, you are enabling them to do these things to the extent that the transportation infrastructure is sort of spiderwebbed out with an enormous amount of investment for a relatively dispersed population. All of these things get a lot harder to pull off. And so I do think that, particularly the last 50 years, as we've ground to a halt, the way we've invested in transportation has accelerated that, and different kinds of transportation investments could help restore American mobility in the geographic sense, which leads to the economic sense. And that would be pretty cool.
That gives me even more negative feelings towards drive till you qualify, which is something that people talk about when they're getting mortgages. The further out you go, the cheaper the housing, but then the more the transportation costs increase. You've been at a lot of talks and you've chatted about the book with a number of people. I'm wondering if there's a question that people haven't asked you that you wish they would.
It's a great question. I've never gotten that one, and I'm glad I did. I think one of the aspects of this that I was fascinated by as I wrote was the multiplicity of housing types that existed until relatively recently. People often think about their own current situations. I get a lot of callers and call-in shows who say things like, I'm living here, I wish I could live there. But at different parts of our lives, we need different kinds of housing, and people in different income brackets need different kinds of housing. And the guy who wrote the original zoning ordinance, Edward Murray Bassett, lived in a dozen different kinds of housing along his journey. He rented a bedroom in somebody's house, illegal in most American cities today. He lived in a bachelor hotel. Again, not something we really have anymore. There were lots of relatively cheap housing options as he was a young man on the move in the make that were available to him that he then effectively outlaws once he has landed someplace with genuine economic security. And that's a conversation I think we really need to have, that it's not just about building more. Right now I'm living in a single family home. If people like single family homes, I think that's great. I love my single family home. It's not the only place I've lived. I doubt it'll be the last place that I live. As I get old, the steps in this house will no longer be easy for me to navigate. There are trade-offs in any housing. And, those preference surveys you're pointing to, if you ask people like, do you want a mansion? Most people are like, yeah, I want a mansion. You say, do you want that mansion if there's a 4-hour commute each way to your job? People will think differently, right? And that trade-off is something that we make whenever we select our housing. And if you give people many more options, then they can get closer to the things that match their needs. 19th century reformers kept on looking, and 20th century reformers, at people living in really bad housing conditions. And there was this kind of blindness that I don't quite get it, but they'd look at, somebody living in a terrible apartment and they'd say, we should ban apartments like that. And then they look at somebody in a tenement and they say, we should ban tenements like that. They never said, let's ban poverty, right? It was always if we could just get rid of the apartment, we'd solve the problem. The apartments were fine. I went back to see my great-grandfather's tenement in New York that was targeted by reformers. That particular building, targeted by reformers as a hellhole. I couldn't rent it. It's $7,200 a month. There was nothing wrong with the apartment. It turned out what was wrong was poverty. And we've gone down a long road in this country of banning housing types as a way to address poverty, and produced an enormous homelessness crisis as a result. And if we can get back to a wider array of housing styles that are permitted in our communities, I think that we could give people a better chance to find the housing that works for them at their particular situation.
Very well said. The book is Stuck: How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. Where can folks find a copy if they wish to purchase this wonderful book?
I always encourage people to seek out their local independent bookstore. You can find a copy anywhere, but there's something special about walking into a small business and supporting it.
And there's so much more in here than we talked about. I mean, I could talk to you for 3 hours. I feel like there's tenements, there's Jane Jacobs, there's Flint, Michigan. There's all kinds of things in here that I think will touch a lot of folks and give people a lot of information that they need to make places better. Yoni, where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
I'm on X, I guess it's called these days, Yoni Appelbaum. You can find my work in The Atlantic, which is my day job, and you can keep track of the book talks and the rest at yoniappelbaum.com.
Awesome. Well, Yoni, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting TheOverheadWire.com, or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.